Hello, this presentation is going to focus on the discussion, conclusion, and recommendation sections of your capstone project. For some instructors, these are all the same thing. For some, they need to be separate. Depending on the type of paper you're writing, though, the purpose of the discussion is always to synthesize the information presented and discussed in the literature review and in the introduction, meaning your thesis. This is your time to put that literature review and your thesis together with the findings of your primary research. Usually the discussion section is indicated only for the discussion of how your primary research relates to your thesis and how it compares with the literature review. But depending on your instructor, sometimes instructors want a discussion section for you to discuss your opinion of the secondary literature that you got, what you gathered out of it. This would be your time to go beyond just analysis and really give your insight into things based on your own knowledge or your own interpretation of things. But focusing in on the discussion question being something that is really used to focus on your own data and your own research, the idea of the 3 questions for discussion that are most typical would be, what did you discover in your primary research in relation to the research questions and information that you gained from your literature review and your secondary research? In what ways does your research, your primary research, agree or disagree with the research and ideas of others who studied this topic? And what do you think, why do you think these similarities or differences exist? What could be the cause? If you're doing this just based on secondary research and not your own, you're focusing mostly on the similarities and differences which you already discussed in your literature review and now giving your opinion on what you think the cause will be. But again, this varies greatly by instructor, and generally instructors give a lot of very clear questions. If you have any question, see your instructor. So what to include in the discussion section? This is your opportunity to do the objective support for your thesis, discussion of the generalizations, trends, and relationships that can be seen in both primary and secondary research, meaning what does this have to do with your field as a whole, and what does it have to do with what you found specifically in your primary research? Identify and discuss the differences between your work and the work of others. This is based on your analysis and synthesis of your own data, your opinions as to why things happened in your research or didn't. Why do you think your research came out differently, or how is it that it came out the same? What are your basic opinions? And how does your work, most importantly, and even if you're focused just on secondary research, how does your research serve to extend the discussion of your topic in your field, and what can be learned from this research that you've done? And in this discussion section, you want to cite your own work if you're basing it on your own data, and you want to cite, again, the information from your literature review. This is your time to really synthesize it in your own opinion. So what to avoid in the discussion section? You want to avoid bias and ignorance of other perspectives. You want to avoid being overly general in your interpretations and focus on your data. You want to draw conclusions that go beyond the comparison and contrast of your research that you did prior. You've already done that in theory in your literature review. You've already done that in your data when you gave A plus B equals C. Now you want to say why that is. And always you want to avoid that conversational language. You want to avoid cliche and acting like this is just so obvious. You want to make sure you're drawing the connections that need to be made, and make sure that you stick in that third person. Don't use I. Don't refer to your reader as you. Don't say as you can see. Don't do that. Don't say I think this. Get that out of there. Focus on this data shows this and this is why, or it seems to show, or once you compare the data, this is the possibility of what you're looking at, of what can be looked at, and particularly in the discussion section, make sure you're avoiding plagiarism. If this is an idea that is gained from someone else, then it belongs in your literature review. If it is your idea, it can belong in your discussion. If it's based on your idea, it belongs in your discussion. So we've done the discussion section. Again, that discussion section is generally for primary research, but if your instructor wants you to call that discussion your opinion section, that's fine too. It's based on what your instructor says. But in general, your conclusion and recommendation section is where, if you were basing it solely on secondary research, this is where your opinion would come in. Again, the idea of the previous part, the The discussion is mostly for you to discuss your data, but there is, like I said, a bit of play in there based on what your instructor wants. But everyone has to do conclusion and recommendations, and this is either based on secondary and primary, depending on what your instructor requires. So the objective here is to summarize the main idea of your paper, to demonstrate the significance of your research to your field of study, and discuss the current and future applications of your research, the recommendations based on your research. Here you're going to, when you were creating your thesis, you went global to local. Now you're going to go local back out to global. The idea is to take this from a small perspective and into the wider perspective of your field. So when you're focusing on just the conclusion, you're going to these are your further study considerations. What was your most significant finding? This is your review based on everything you've read and researched, your research, the literature review. What's the most significant finding? What can be done to further prove its worth? What else needs to be done to fill this gap? What questions might be answered if you continued to research? What benefit would further study allow? And who locally and globally will benefit? Then the recommendation comes. These are your suggested actions based on your research. What action should your readers or professionals in your field take now, and why? What changes in process or procedure might serve to improve the problem presented in your thesis? What might be done now in your industry to follow and develop or improve based on your idea or further research? And who will benefit right now? What can they hope to gain? What is the goal? Go back to your purpose and make suggested actions. There's a lot to avoid here, though. Avoid repetition. So often people cut and paste from their introduction to their abstract to their conclusion. Don't do that. By the time you're at the end of your paper, you should have something new and different to say. You should be able to pull it all together. Often you're going to write your introduction actually last and base your introduction as much on your conclusion as your conclusion is based on your introduction. Always, though, it's based on your thesis. What is it you were trying to say, and what's the purpose, and how did you prove it? Avoid generalities. Don't make recommendations that aren't specific. Make sure you offer specific ideas for execution. Avoid bias and overconfidence. Your tone must be persuasive. Can't be presented as a directive. Even when I edit for tutoring or when I review for tutoring, it's very important to make sure that it's a recommendation. It's not a mandate. These are things you're developing based on your research. They're not necessarily the be-all, end-all answer. The topic should be based on analysis of your research, not your opinion. And your connections, therefore, have to be clearly drawn. You can't just assume your reader is going to come along with you and say, you'll see here. You can't do that. You need to draw the connections for them, and you need to make sure that your conclusion is the same one your reader is getting to, based on how you would relate the information. Make sure that you do not ignore the possible ramifications of your recommendations. Could your recommendations cause problems for someone? And based on what? What problems might your recommendations, what problems might people run into trying to do these recommendations, even if it's just further study? And then your first and second point of view, coming back to that. So often in this paper, people have a hard time maintaining that third person point of view. They become conversational and sort of flippant. Make sure you're using the terms that belong to your industry. Don't make up terms, don't speak in overly conversational tones, and make sure that you do not reference your reader directly as you or yourself as I. As you're doing this, your resources for conclusion recommendations, again, that USC website, and another one here is the Indiana University. It has several suggestions for approaching your conclusion and your paragraphs and some examples to follow. I hope this is helpful. Good luck.